The sun was a merciless hammer over the Chihuahuan desert, beating down on the cracked earth until the air itself shimmered with heat. It bleached the life from everything it touched, leaving behind a world of pale rock, brittle scrub, and bone-white sand. This was a land that didn't care for men, their laws, or their sorrows. It simply was, vast and indifferent. Through this shimmering emptiness rode Will Creed. He sat atop his dun-colored mare, a steady, patient animal named Dusty, with the ease of a man who had spent more of his life in a saddle than on his own 2 feet. Will was not a large man, but he was built of whipcord and gristle, every line of him pared down to necessity by the sun and the trail. His face was a map of hard miles, tanned to the color of old leather and etched with lines around his eyes from squinting into 1,000 unforgiving sunrises. A dusty brown hat was pulled low, shadowing a gaze that saw everything and revealed nothing. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he measured out his energy like a man counting his last few coins. He had left the army 5 years back, left the noise, the orders, the blue uniform that had begun to feel like a cage. He'd seen enough of what men did to each other in the name of flags and futures to last him a lifetime. Now, he chased the horizon. He wasn't running from anything. Not really. He was just moving toward the quiet. The desert offered that in abundance. Here, the only sounds were the wind, the cry of a hawk, and the steady, rhythmic clopping of Dusty's hooves against the stone-littered ground. It was a language he understood. Dusty flicked an ear, her pace faltering for a half-step. Will's hand, resting on his thigh, went still. He didn't pull the reins, just let his weight shift slightly, a silent question to the horse. Her head turned toward a jagged outcrop of red rock, a formation that looked like a set of broken teeth jutting from the desert floor. Will's eyes followed her gaze. There was nothing there but shadow and stone. But a horse's senses were truer than a man's compass. He had learned that lesson more than once. He nudged Dusty forward, not directly toward the rocks, but in a slow, wide arc that kept them in his line of sight. His hand drifted down, fingers brushing the worn wooden grip of the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. It was a gesture as natural and unconscious as breathing. The silence had changed. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. As he drew closer, he saw it. A splash of color against the rust-red stone that didn't belong. Not the muted green of a hardy bush or the brown of a dried-out cactus. It was a faded calico blue, the color of a woman's dress. And near it, a dark stain that the sun had baked to the color of old rust, blood. He dismounted smoothly, his spurs making no sound in the soft sand. He left Dusty untethered. She wouldn't stray. Each step he took was measured, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. He moved with a predator's grace. But his intent was not to hunt. It was simply to see. He rounded the edge of the largest boulder and stopped, huddled in a narrow crevice, barely deep enough to conceal her. Was a woman, or a girl. It was hard to tell. Her dress, the patch of blue he had seen, was torn at the shoulder and hemmed with grime and the same dark, dried blood. Her hair, a tangle of dark strands, had escaped its pins and clung to her sweat-streaked face. Her skin was pale beneath a layer of dust, except for a dark bruise blooming high on one cheekbone. But it was her hands that held his attention. They were wrapped around an old Star revolver, a heavy, clumsy weapon for such a small frame. And they were trembling. Not a slight tremor, but a violent, uncontrollable shaking, as if her entire body was a plucked string. Despite the shaking, her grip on the gun was absolute. The barrel was pointed directly at his chest. Her eyes met his. They were the color of a stormy sky, filled with a terror so profound it was almost paralyzing. But beneath the fear, deep within those gray depths, a different light flickered, a hard, defiant spark. It was the look of a cornered animal that had decided it would rather die fighting than be taken. Her voice, when it came, was a dry rasp, cracked by thirst and fear, yet it carried an unmistakable edge of command. "Keep your distance," she warned. Will Creed did not move. He did not raise his hands. He did not speak. He simply stood there, his shadowed gaze taking in the scene without judgment. He saw the gun, the blood, the terror, and the fight. He had seen all of it before, in different places, on different faces. The story was always the same, only the names changed. He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion that was meant to be seen and understood, he stepped back, one step, then another. He turned his back on her, a calculated risk, an offering of trust in a place where trust was a fool's currency. He walked back to his horse. 50 paces. He counted them in his head. A habit from his army days. 50 paces was a safe distance, not too close to be a threat, not so far as to be an abandonment. It was the distance of a wary truce. He began to make camp. The woman in the rocks watched his every move. She saw him slide the rifle from its scabbard on his saddle and lean it against a rock, well out of his immediate reach. She watched him unsaddle Dusty, his hands moving with a familiar, gentle competence as he checked the mare's back for sores and rubbed her down with a piece of burlap. He spoke to the animal in a low, rumbling murmur, words too soft for her to hear, but the tone was calming, steady. He moved without haste, a man with no appointments to keep. He gathered dry mesquite branches, breaking them over his knee with a sharp crack that made her flinch, her knuckles whitening on the grip of her revolver. He laid a small, neat fire in a ring of stones he cleared with the toe of his boot. When he struck a match, the hiss of the sulfur seemed unnaturally loud in the profound silence. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. The heat of the day started to bleed out of the land, replaced by the creeping chill of the desert night. The small fire he'd built crackled to life, a tiny beacon of warmth and light in the growing dark. He still hadn't looked back at her, not once. It was this, more than anything, that kept her hidden in the crevice. A different man would have pressed her, demanded answers, or tried to take the gun. A different man would have seen her as a prize, a victim, or a problem to be solved. This man, this silent stranger, seemed to see her as just another part of the landscape, something to be given a wide berth, like a rattlesnake or a patch of unstable ground. His indifference was a strange and unexpected shield. It gave her space to breathe, to let the violent trembling in her hands subside to a manageable tremor. Will opened his saddlebags and took out a small, dented coffee pot, a tin cup, and a slab of jerky wrapped in oilcloth. He filled the pot from his canteen and set it on the rocks at the edge of the fire. The smell of coffee soon began to curl into the cool night air, a rich, earthy scent that spoke of 1,000 lonely campfires just like this one. He ate his jerky slowly, tearing off pieces with his teeth, his eyes on the flames. He seemed entirely self-contained, a man who needed nothing and no one. He was a stone, weathered and worn smooth by the world, asking for nothing. The moon rose, a sliver of silver in a sky littered with stars so bright they looked like chips of ice. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks into the darkness. From far away, a coyote yelped, its lonely call answered by another. Clara, for that was her name, though it felt like it belonged to someone else. Someone from a different lifetime felt a wave of exhaustion so complete it was a physical pain. She hadn't slept in what felt like days. Her body ached, her head throbbed, and her stomach was a tight, empty knot. The star revolver felt impossibly heavy in her lap now. The immediate terror had receded, leaving behind a deep, weary ache of dread. She watched the man by the fire. He finished his simple meal, rinsed his cup with a splash of water, and laid out his bedroll on the far side of the fire, using his saddle as a pillow. He took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair, a simple, human gesture that was somehow more disarming than any word he could have spoken. He lay down, pulling a worn wool blanket over himself. For a long time, he just stared up at the stars. Clara wondered what he was thinking, what past was written on the quiet plains of his face. She wondered if he was as alone as he seemed, or if he carried ghosts with him, the way she did. Her own ghosts were fresh. They were the reason for the blood on her dress, the gun in her hands, and the frantic, desperate flight that had brought her to this desolate corner of the world. The man by the fire shifted. He turned his head, and for the first time since he had walked away, he looked directly toward the rocks where she was hiding. His face was half in shadow, half in the flickering firelight. His eyes seemed to find hers in the darkness. He still didn't speak. He just held her gaze for a beat. Then he looked away, settling his head back onto his saddle. Within minutes, his breathing deepened into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. Clara did not sleep. She sat in her stone crevice, the cold seeping into her bones, the heavy revolver a dead weight in her lap. She listened to the man's breathing, the crackle of the fire, the vast, empty silence of the desert. He hadn't forced her to speak. He hadn't tried to help. He hadn't asked a single question. He had simply given her 50 paces of distance and a fire to watch in the dark. She did not leave, and he did not ask why. In the unforgiving heart of the desert, this strange, unspoken courtesy was more valuable than gold. It was a reason to see the sunrise. Dawn broke not with a gentle blush, but with a sharp, brutal line of light across the eastern horizon. The desert night had been bone-achingly cold, a cold that seeped through stone and cloth, and Clara felt as if the chill had settled deep within her marrow. She was stiff. Every muscle ached from the unnatural posture she had held for hours in the rock crevice. The star revolver lay heavy in her lap, no longer a weapon of defiance, but a cold, dense reminder of her reality. Across the 50 paces of open ground, Will Creed was already moving. He had not risen with a start, but had simply unfolded himself from his bedroll as the first light touched the peaks, as if he were part of the landscape's own waking process. His movements were economical, stripped of any wasted motion. He added a few pieces of mesquite to the glowing embers of the fire, and the flames greedily licked back to life, casting long, dancing shadows in the pre-dawn gloom. Clara watched him. Her eyes narrowed. She had spent the night cataloging every sound, his steady breathing, the shifting of his horse, the whisper of the wind, and had found no threat in them. Yet, the fear remained. A coiled snake in her gut. Trust was a luxury she had lost the patent for. Will filled the coffee pot from his canteen and set it on the fire. He didn't look her way, didn't acknowledge her vigil. He seemed entirely absorbed in his morning ritual, a simple sequence of tasks that gave structure to a life lived without walls. To him, she might as well have been another silent boulder. This continued indifference was both a comfort and a vexation. It allowed her to remain hidden, but it also underscored her profound isolation. The aroma of coffee, strong and bitter, once again drifted on the morning air. It was a scent from another life, a life of kitchen stoves and morning routines, a world away from this raw survival. It made the knot of hunger in her stomach tighten. Will poured a cup for himself. Then he did something unexpected. He poured a second cup, the dark liquid steaming in the cool air. He rose, walked about 25 paces toward her, and placed the tin cup on a large, flat rock that sat in the space between them. Then, without a word or a backward glance, he returned to his place by the fire. It was an offering, a silent negotiation. It was not a command, nor was it an act of charity that demanded gratitude. It was simply a fact there was coffee, and here was a cup. Clara remained motionless for a long time, watching the steam rise from the cup in thinning wisps. The sun was climbing now, its rays striking the tops of the rock formations and turning them a fiery red. The warmth had not yet reached the ground, and she shivered, the tremor running through her from head to toe. Thirst was a rasp in her throat, the thought of something warm, something other than the metallic taste of fear. was a powerful lure. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up. Her legs were numb, and she stumbled. Catching herself against the rock wall, the revolver clattered from her lap, and she snatched it up instantly, her heart hammering against her ribs. Across the clearing, Will didn't so much as turn his head. He just sat, sipping his own coffee, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself out of the crevice and into the open. Each step felt like a mile. She was exposed now, vulnerable, with nothing but 50 paces of empty space between her and the silent man. She kept the revolver in her right hand, its barrel pointed at the ground. Her eyes never left him. She reached the rock and hesitated before picking up the cup. The tin was hot against her cold fingers. She brought it to her lips, the bitter, scalding liquid a shock to her system. It was the first thing she had tasted besides dust and despair in 2 days. She drank it down in greedy gulps, the warmth spreading through her chest, a small, temporary truce with the misery that had consumed her. As she stood there, bathed in the clean morning light, the torn fabric of her dress shifted. The rip at her shoulder was wide, and it exposed not just the dark bruise from a recent struggle, but older, paler marks beneath it. On the delicate skin of her shoulder was a latticework of thin, silvery scars, the kind left by something that bites and holds. They were old wounds, long healed, but they told a story of a pain that was not new. She lowered the cup, and as she did, the frayed cuff of her sleeve slid back, revealing her wrist. Encircling it was a faint, discolored band of skin, a permanent shadow where the flesh had been rubbed raw and healed over poorly, time and time again. Will's eyes, which had seemed fixed on the distant mountains, flickered toward her for a fraction of a second. His gaze was not curious or pitying. It was the quick, appraising glance of a man who knew how to read signs, the track of a deer, the meaning of a storm cloud on the horizon, the history written on a woman's skin. He saw the marks. He understood what they implied. And then he looked away, granting her the privacy of her own history. That small act of looking away loosened something inside her. It was a gesture that cost him nothing. Yet it was a profound gift. He had seen her damage and had not recoiled, nor had he pressed for the story that went with it. The day passed in a strange, silent accord. Will rode out for a few hours, returning with 2 rabbits tied to his saddle. Clara, driven by a deep-seated instinct to be useful, to earn her keep, had rebuilt the fire and found a small, brackish spring seeping from the rocks, enough to refill the canteens. They cooked and ate the rabbits with little more than a nod exchanged between them. The silence was their common language, a shared territory where the past could be kept at bay. But the past does not stay buried forever. It is a restless ghost, and it walks in the dark. That night, the desert cold was even more severe. The fire was their only anchor in a vast, indifferent sea of blackness. Clara had huddled near its warmth, wrapping her arms around her knees, the heavy revolver once again resting beside her. Will lay in his bedroll, seemingly asleep. A sudden gust of wind sent sparks spiraling into the night, and in their fleeting light, Clara saw a face, not Will's, but another, the face of Elias Thorne, the man who owned the valley she had fled, the man whose brand was on every head of cattle, every acre of land, and, he had believed, on her. The memory was so vivid she flinched, a small, choked sound escaping her lips. From across the fire, a low voice cut through the darkness. "Just the wind!" She looked up, startled. Will was propped on one elbow, his silhouette dark against the starry sky. He wasn't looking at her, but into the flames. She said nothing for a long time. The fire crackled, and the silence stretched, but it was different now. He had opened a door, just a crack. He had acknowledged her fear. Her voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper, thin and frayed. She spoke to the dancing flames, not to him. He, the owner of the ranch. The words came out haltingly, as if they were stones she had to dredge up from a deep, cold well. Mr. Thorne. He owns everything. The land, the water, the people. She paused, swallowing hard. My father was his foreman. After Papa died in a cattle stampede last spring, Mr. Thorne said he would look after me. He said it was my father's dying wish. Another long silence. Will remained perfectly still, listening. He did not prompt her, did not rush her. He simply provided a space for the words to fall into. Looking after me meant ownership. He wanted a wife, a young one, to give him a son. He made it clear it wasn't a proposal, it was a decree. Her hands clenched in her lap. He told everyone the wedding was in a month. He liked to show me off, his new property. She finally risked a glance at Will. His expression was unreadable in the flickering light, his face a mask of shadows. He has men, she whispered, her voice trembling now. Hired guns, 5 of them. They watch his back. They do what he says. They don't ask questions. One of them, he was the one who... She touched her shoulder, where the torn dress exposed the old scars. She didn't need to finish the sentence. I knew I wouldn't be his... The spark of defiance he had first seen in her eyes returned, a hot ember in the darkness. So I ran. The night before they were to announce it formally. I took what I could. She gestured to the revolver beside her. This was his, kept it in his study. I took a few dollars from the tin box on his desk, and a map. The word hung in the air. A map. It was the one piece of the story that spoke of a destination, of a plan beyond simple flight. It was in his ledger, she continued, the words coming faster now, tumbling out. A map to a place called Red Hollow. I saw him studying it. He keeps records of everything. All his dealings. I think the truth of what he is there. I thought if I could get there, I could, find something to make him stop. Her story ended as abruptly as it began. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering, though it wasn't from the cold anymore. She had laid her soul bare to a stranger, and the vulnerability was terrifying. She expected questions, judgment, maybe even disbelief. Will Creed did not ask a single one. He did not ask who Thorne was, or where his ranch was located, or what she expected to find at Red Hollow. He accepted her fragmented, fearful story as it was offered, a complete thing in its own right. He slowly pushed himself to his feet. For a moment, she thought he was going to walk away, to leave her alone with her ghosts. Instead, he went to his saddlebags, pulled out a second, thicker wool blanket, and walked to the edge of the firelight. He stopped a few feet from her, well outside her personal space. He held the blanket for a moment, then gently laid it on the ground near her. He returned to his bedroll and lay down, turning his back to the fire. The gesture was simple, profound, and more comforting than any words could ever be. It was an offering of warmth without condition. It was an acknowledgement of her pain without the intrusion of questions. It was a silent promise, not of protection, but of presence. Clara stared at the blanket for a long time. Then, with a trembling hand, she reached out and pulled it toward her, wrapping its coarse, warm weight around her shoulders. It smelled faintly of horse, leather, and wood smoke. It smelled of the trail. It smelled of a quiet, solitary strength. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt a flicker, however faint, of something that was not fear. 2 days passed in the crucible of the desert sun, each a mirror of the one before. A fragile, unspoken rhythm established itself in the small clearing. Will would hunt or scout the surrounding territory, always returning before dusk. Clara would tend the fire, fetch water from the meager spring, and once, using a needle and thread from Will's small mending kit, she carefully stitched the tear in her own dress. They moved around each other with the quiet wariness of two wild creatures who had agreed to share the same waterhole. The 50 paces between them had shrunk, not in physical distance, but in the weight of the silence. It was no longer a silence of suspicion, but one of shared existence. Words were rare and functional. Water's low. Wind's coming from the north. That's the last of the jerky. Yet, in the shared glances over the fire, in the simple act of passing a tin cup, a different kind of language was taking root. Clara found herself watching the way his hands moved, steady and capable whether he was cleaning a rabbit or reloading his rifle. Will, in turn, noticed the way she would sometimes pause and stare out at the horizon, her jaw set, the defiant spark in her eyes burning low but never quite extinguishing. He saw the fight in her was a deep, banked ember, waiting for a reason to catch flame again. It was on the afternoon of the third day that the world tore open. The first sign was not a sight, but a feeling, a subtle shift in the air, a vibration felt through the soles of their boots. Will, who had been cleaning his rifle by the fire, went utterly still. His head came up, his eyes fixed on the distant, shimmering haze to the south. Clara, who was returning from the spring with a full canteen, saw the change in him and froze. Then came the sound, faint at first, a low, rhythmic drumming that was not the pulse of the earth. It was the sound of shod hooves on hard-packed ground, moving with purpose, moving fast. Will's voice was low, flat, and devoid of any emotion. "Get in the rocks, the same place as before. Stay down and do not make a sound." There was no room for questions. The quiet man was gone, replaced by a soldier. His movements were a blur of efficiency. He snatched up the rifle, checked the action with a metallic click that echoed in the sudden silence, and grabbed a small canvas pouch of cartridges from his saddlebag. Clara scrambled back into the narrow crevice that had been her first refuge, her heart a frantic bird beating against her ribs. She pressed herself against the cold stone, the rough surface scraping her cheek. The star revolver, which she had taken to keeping tucked into the waistband of her dress, felt like a useless lump of lead. She was a frightened girl with a stolen gun. He was something else entirely. Will did not hide. He moved to the edge of the rock formation, finding a position that gave him a clear view of the approaching trail while offering him cover. He knelt, resting the long barrel of his Winchester on a flat-topped boulder. He became as still and silent as the stone around him, another feature of the harsh landscape. The drumming grew louder, resolving into the distinct sound of 3 horses being pushed hard. Soon they appeared, cresting a low rise, dark figures distorted by the heat haze. As they drew closer, their forms solidified. 3 riders. They were hard-looking men, their faces burned by the sun and etched with cruelty. They wore their guns high and their hats low, and they rode with the slouching arrogance of men who took what they wanted and burned the rest. They were following Clara's tracks. From the desperate first day of her flight, they reined in their tired, sweating horses 100 yards from the camp, their eyes scanning the clearing. One of them, a thick-set man with a grimy beard, pointed with his chin toward the dead campfire. "She was here. Tracks are fresh." Another, younger and thinner with a nervous energy about him, licked his dry lips. "Maybe she's still close. Thorne said he'd pay double if we brought her back unmarked." The third man, who seemed to be the leader, spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the sand. He was older than the others, with cold, dead eyes that missed nothing. "She ain't the only one who's been here. See that 2 sets of prints? Man's boots." He turned his dead eyes toward the rocks. "And a smart horse left to graze. He's here, hiding like a lizard." He raised his voice, a grating sound that scraped the air. "We know you're in there. We just want the girl. She belongs to Mr. Thorne. Throw her out, and we'll ride on. You can have her gun and whatever coin she's carrying. That's a fair deal." From his position, Will remained motionless. The rifle butt settled firmly against his shoulder. His breathing was slow and even. He had faced men like this before. Men who believed their numbers and their noise gave them the right of way. They saw the world as a thing to be bullied into submission. Clara, hidden in her crevice, squeezed her eyes shut. Her whole body was trembling, a violent, bone-jarring quake she couldn't control. This was it, the end of her flight. They had found her. The terror was a physical thing, a cold hand squeezing her throat, stealing her breath. She thought of Thorne's face, of his possessive hands, and a wave of nausea washed over her. The leader waited a moment, then shrugged. "Have it your way." He started to raise his own rifle. Before he could bring it to bear, a deafening crack echoed from the rocks. It wasn't the dull boom of a pistol, but the sharp, flat report of a Winchester. A puff of dust exploded from the face of a boulder not 5 feet from the leader's head. The whine of the ricochet was like an angry hornet. It was a warning shot, a declaration. It said, "I am here. I see you. Do not come closer." The 3 men reacted instantly. Yanking their horses back, the younger one looked terrified, his eyes wide. "He's got a rifle! Jebediah, the leader, glared at the rocks. His face contorted in a snarl of fury. His authority had been challenged. "He's one man. We flush him out, Silas. You circle left. I'll keep him pinned." It was a foolish, arrogant plan. Born of wounded pride, Silas, the bearded one, spurred his horse. Intending to flank Will's position, he presented a clear, moving target against the open ground. The Winchester cracked again. This time, there was no puff of dust. There was a wet, meaty thud. Silas cried out, a sound that was half scream, half gasp, and dropped his rifle. He clutched at his thigh, where a dark, wet stain was already spreading rapidly across his dusty trousers. His horse, spooked by the sound and the scent of blood, reared and bolted, carrying its wounded rider away in a panicked, uncontrolled gallop. The fight was over before it had truly begun. One shot to warn, one shot to end it. Jebediah stared after his wounded man, then looked back at the rocks where the shooter remained invisible. The cold reality of the situation finally penetrated his pride. The man in the rocks was not some drifter to be scared off. He was a marksman. He was patient, and he was not shooting to miss. The younger man was already turning his horse. "I ain't dying for Thorne's girl," he yelled, and spurred his mount, racing back the way they had come. Jebediah lingered for a moment longer, his face a mask of hatred. He cast one last venomous glare at the silent rocks, then wheeled his horse around and followed, leaving the silence, the faint smell of gunpowder, and the dark splashes of blood on the sand behind him. The silence that descended was more profound than any that had come before. It was a silence filled with the echo of violence. Clara remained huddled in the crevice, her body still racked with tremors. She had her hands pressed over her ears, though the sound of the rifle shots was still ringing in her head. She heard Will's boots crunching on the gravel as he moved from his position. He walked out into the clearing, his rifle held loosely in one hand, his eyes scanning the horizon where the riders had disappeared. He stood there for a full minute, watching, ensuring they were truly gone. Finally, he turned and looked toward her hiding place. "They're gone." His voice was calm, the same flat tone as before. It was as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just faced down 3 men and shed blood on the desert floor. Slowly, shakily, Clara emerged from the rocks. She looked at Will, standing there in the harsh afternoon light, a pillar of quiet lethality. Then her eyes fell on the dark, wet patches on the sand where Silas's blood had dripped. The sight made her stomach churn. This was real. This was not a story. Blood had been spilled. For her. She looked back at Will, and a storm of emotions crashed through her terror. Relief, confusion, and a strange, bewildering sense of awe. He had not run, he had not bartered. He had stood his ground and fired his rifle. He had put himself between her and them. No one had ever done that before. In her world, men like him took what they wanted. They didn't protect. Her voice was a hoarse whisper, raw with emotion. "Why He turned to fully face her, and for the first time, his gaze was direct, holding hers, the shadows in his eyes giving way to something she couldn't name. He saw the shock on her face, the tears welling in her stormy gray eyes, the trembling that still shook her small frame. "Why did you do that?" she asked again, the words stumbling out. "You don't know me. You could have been killed. Why?" Will Creed looked at this tattered, terrified girl who had run into the desert with nothing but a stolen gun and a desperate hope. He thought of the first time he had seen her, huddled in the rocks, shaking so hard it seemed she might fall apart, but with a fire in her eyes that refused to be extinguished. He had seen that same fire tonight, when she had spoken of the man who tried to own her, the quiet fury in her voice. He had seen a spirit that had been bent and bruised, but not broken. He gave his answer. The words were simple, spare, and spoken with a quiet finality that resonated deeper than any grand declaration. "Because you were trembling," he said, his voice low and rough. "But you still didn't run." Will's words hung in the air between them, stark and absolute against the sudden silence of the desert. "Because you were trembling, but you still didn't run." They were not words of comfort or praise, but a simple statement of fact, a reason forged in the hard calculus of survival and character. For Clara, they landed with the force of a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs and leaving an unfamiliar warmth in their wake. No one had ever seen the fight in her, only the fear. They had only ever seen a thing to be used or a victim to be pitied. This man, this quiet, lethal stranger, had seen her brokenness and found strength in it. The immediate aftermath of the violence was a blur. The adrenaline that had flooded her system ebbed away, leaving a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. She watched as Will methodically erased the signs of their camp, his movements economical and swift. He scattered the ashes of their fire until they were just a dark smudge on the sand, and used a branch to brush away their footprints around the clearing. He was a man who knew how to disappear. "We can't stay here," he said, not looking at her. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order born of necessity. "The one who got away will bring the others. Thorn will not let this go." Clara nodded, her throat too tight for words. The name Thorn was a fresh poison in the air. The brief illusion of safety she had found in this small pocket of rocks had been shattered. Now, the entire desert felt like a trap. Will saddled his mare, Dusty, and then, without a word, he walked over to where Clara's horse, a scrawny gelding she had run from the ranch, stood nervously tethered. He checked its hooves and tightened the cinch on her worn saddle with an expert hand. He did not offer her help up, a small but significant courtesy that recognized she was not an invalid. He simply held the reins for a moment, his gaze meeting hers. A silent question. "Are you ready?" She swung herself into the saddle, her movements stiff and clumsy with fatigue. He mounted Dusty in a single fluid motion, and they rode out, leaving the rock formation and the dark splashes of blood behind them, swallowed by the immense, indifferent landscape. They rode north, climbing out of the low, sun-baked basin and into the higher country. The terrain changed, the cracked earth and sparse scrub giving way to rolling plains of grama grass and scattered, wind-twisted juniper trees. The air grew thinner, cooler. They were more exposed here, but as Will explained in a few clipped sentences, they could also see for miles in every direction. There would be no more surprises. For 2 days, they pushed onward, stopping only for brief rests to water the horses and chew on the last of Will's jerky. The silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. Before the gunfight, it had been the silence of two strangers sharing a space. Now, it was the silence of two people bound by a shared, violent secret. Clara found herself watching him constantly, studying the straight line of his back, the way his eyes ceaselessly scanned the horizon, the quiet competence in his hands on the reins. He had become her compass, her shield. The thought was both terrifying and deeply comforting. Late on the second day, he led them into a shallow canyon, hidden from the open plains by a stand of hardy piñon pines. A thin trickle of clear water, more a seep than a spring, ran down a rock face, pooling in a small basin before disappearing into the sandy ground. It was a good place, defensible, with water and shelter from the biting wind that swept across the high plains at night. "We'll stay here for a while," Will announced. "Let the trail grow cold." That evening, they began to build a life. It was a life stripped down to its barest essentials: shelter, water, fire, food. Will used his hand axe to cut sturdy pine branches, while Clara, following his lead, gathered smaller boughs and armfuls of dry grass. Together, they constructed a lean-to against the canyon wall, a simple, three-sided structure that would offer some protection from the elements. They didn't speak as they worked, but their movements fell into a natural rhythm. He would set a heavy support beam in place, and she would be there with smaller branches to weave between the gaps. It was a partnership born not of words, but of shared labor, a silent, mutual agreement to survive. The next morning, Will rose before dawn. "I'm going to hunt," he said, checking his Winchester. "Don't let the fire go out, and don't wander far from the canyon." Clara watched him ride out, a solitary figure melting into the gray pre-dawn light, until he was gone. The immense silence of the high plains descended upon her, but for the first time, it did not feel threatening. It felt peaceful. She was alone, but she was not abandoned. There was a profound difference between the two. She knew he would be back. She spent the day gathering firewood, her movements slow and deliberate. She found a wild bush with tart, edible berries and filled her pockets. She tidied their small, pathetic camp, arranging their meager possessions with a sense of order that felt like a rebellion against the chaos that had chased her here. She was not just a fugitive anymore. She was a keeper of the camp. It was a small, fragile purpose, but it was hers. Will returned in the late afternoon with a young doe slung over his saddle. The sight of it, of him, appearing on the canyon rim against the setting sun, stirred something deep inside her, a feeling of relief so potent it almost brought her to her knees. That night, they ate well for the first time. Will dressed the deer with a practiced efficiency that was both fascinating and brutal to watch. Clara, who had learned to cook in the rough ranch kitchens, stewed the meat with the berries she had found in their one small pot, creating a simple, savory soup that was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. They ate in their usual silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the sigh of the wind in the pines. In the flickering firelight, she noticed a long, dark tear in the sleeve of his canvas shirt, probably from a stray branch. It was a small detail, but it bothered her. The shirt, like the man himself, seemed worn but durable, and the tear was a violation of its integrity. The next evening, after they had eaten, she took the small mending kit from his saddlebag. "Give me your shirt," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, he unbuttoned the shirt and handed it to her. The firelight played over the hard, lean muscles of his chest and shoulders, crisscrossed with the pale, faded lines of old scars. They were different from her own scars. His were the marks of battles fought and survived, not the brands of ownership. She took the shirt and focused on the task, her fingers, clumsy at first, growing more confident with each stitch. She was intensely aware of him watching her, of his stillness on the other side of the fire. She wasn't just mending a piece of cloth. She was repaying a debt, in the only currency she possessed. She was stitching a small piece of order back into their fractured world. When she was finished, the seam was neat and strong. She folded the shirt and placed it on a rock near him without a word. He simply nodded, his eyes lingering on her for a moment longer than usual before he looked away. A few days later, it was his turn. Clara had been hauling a large piece of fallen pine back to the camp for the fire. As she heaved it onto the woodpile, a sharp, searing pain shot through the sole of her foot. She cried out, stumbling back and sitting down hard. A large, jagged splinter of wood had driven itself deep into her arch, through the thin, worn leather of her boot. Will was by her side in an instant. "Let me see," he said, his voice low. She hesitated, then reluctantly extended her foot. He knelt before her, and with a surprising gentleness, he worked the battered boot off her foot. Her feet were bare, dusty, and calloused, and she felt a flush of shame. He paid it no mind. His focus was entirely on the ugly, protruding splinter. "This will hurt," he said, his voice a quiet warning. He took his knife from his belt, the blade gleaming in the sunlight. With one hand, he held her foot in a firm, steady grip. With the other, he used the tip of the knife to carefully, precisely work the splinter free. Clara bit her lip, her knuckles white as she gripped the ground on either side of her. The pain was sharp, intense, but it was his touch that unnerved her more. His large, calloused hands that were so capable with a rifle and an axe, were impossibly gentle. His grip was strong, but not confining. It was the touch of a healer, not an owner. When the splinter finally came free, a long, dark sliver of wood, she let out a shuddering breath. He cleaned the small, bleeding wound with a splash of whiskey from his flask, the sting making her hiss. Then, he tore a clean strip of cloth from his own bandana and carefully bandaged her foot. His work done, he remained kneeling before her for a moment. He looked up, his gray eyes meeting hers. They were so close now, closer than they had ever been. She could see the fine lines etched around his eyes, the flecks of brown in the gray of his irises. In that shared gaze, 1,000 unspoken words passed between them. There was gratitude. There was acknowledgement. There was a raw, fragile connection that had been forged in silence and solidified in these small, intimate acts of care. It was a look that went deeper than skin, a recognition of the survivor in each other's eyes. He released her foot and rose, stepping back, returning the space between them. The moment was broken, but not forgotten. That night, as the stars blazed with a fierce, cold light in the vast, dark sky, the peace of their small canyon began to feel like a fragile, beautiful lie. This quiet domesticity, this growing trust. It was a life she had never imagined for herself, and it terrified her. It felt temporary, a brief respite before the storm that was surely still coming. It felt like something that could be snatched away at any moment. It felt like hope. And hope was the most dangerous feeling of all. She looked across the fire at Will, who was oiling his colt with methodical, practiced movements. He was a constant, a rock in the swirling chaos of her life, and that constancy was beginning to feel like a chain she was forging for herself. She had run from one man's ownership. She could not bear to become dependent on another's protection. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but it held a slight, sharp edge, a warning to him, and perhaps to herself. "Don't get used to me," she said, looking into the flames. Will's hand stilled. He slowly raised his head, his eyes finding hers across the fire. He saw the fear in them, the old, familiar fear that this fragile peace was a mirage, that permanence was an illusion. He saw her trying to push him away, to protect herself from the pain of a future loss. He didn't argue. He didn't offer false reassurances or empty promises. He knew that words were cheap and that her fear had been earned. He simply held her gaze for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement of her words, of her fear. Then he gave a single slow nod. He returned to his work, the quiet, rhythmic sound of the oiled cloth on steel filling the space between them. He had accepted her warning. He had heard her. But when the sun rose the next morning, a pale, hopeful light spilling into their hidden canyon, he was still there. He had not ridden away. He had built up the fire, and the coffee was already brewing. He stayed, and in the silent, stubborn language of the high plains, His presence was the only answer that mattered. The fragile peace of the high canyon lasted a week. It was a week of quiet mornings and evenings spent by the fire, a week where the shared, silent labor of survival began to feel less like a truce and more like a partnership. Clara learned the patterns of Will's movements, the way he would pause on the canyon rim at dusk, a dark silhouette against the dying light, his eyes scanning the vast plains below before descending to their camp. He learned the rhythm of her breathing as she slept, the way she would hum a tuneless, mournful melody while she mended his clothes, a sound so soft it was almost part of the wind. Trust, Clara discovered, was not a decision. It was a plant that grew in the dark, a slow, tenacious thing that took root in the soil of shared hardship and consistent action. It had wrapped itself around her heart so quietly, so gradually, that she hadn't even noticed until it was there, a delicate, vital part of her. She had stopped sleeping with the heavy star revolver clutched in her hand. She had begun to believe that when the sun rose, he would still be there. Then the rains came. It started in the late afternoon, not as a gentle shower, but as a sudden, violent assault. The sky, which had been a clear, high blue, turned the color of a bruise. The wind rose to a mournful shriek, tearing through the pinon pines, and the heavens opened. Rain fell in cold, hard sheets, turning the canyon floor into a slick of red mud and transforming the gentle seep of their spring into a gushing torrent. They huddled in the lean-to, the fire hissing and spitting in protest just outside the opening. The world was reduced to the small, smoky space of their shelter and the relentless, deafening drumming of the storm. It was a night for ghosts, a night that clawed at old wounds and made the darkness feel alive. Clara felt a familiar, cold prickle of anxiety. In the chaos of the storm, the feeling of being hunted returned with a vengeance. Her hand went unconsciously to the small, hidden pocket she had sewn into the lining of her dress, the place she kept her few stolen dollars. Then, a more urgent, sickening thought seized her. The map. It was her only weapon, her only hope. The flimsy, creased piece of paper that held the secret of Red Hollow. It was too precious, too fragile to keep on her person. After the second day in the canyon, feeling a false sense of security, she had tucked it away. She had wrapped the folded paper in a small piece of oilskin and hidden it at the bottom of her small, worn satchel, buried beneath her spare pair of socks and a small, carved bird her father had made for her years ago. The satchel was always by her side. Inside the lean-to, it was safe. But the anxiety was a physical thing now, a cold knot in her stomach. She had to be sure. She had to touch it, to feel the crisp edges of the paper through the oilskin, to reassure herself that her one desperate plan was still intact. Reaching for the satchel, she pulled it onto her lap. The leather was damp and cold. Her fingers, trembling slightly, fumbled with the buckle. She pushed aside the socks, the small wooden bird. Her fingers dug deeper, searching for the familiar, slick feel of the oilskin packet. It wasn't there. Her heart gave a single, painful thud. Panic, cold and sharp, shot through her veins. She pulled everything out of the satchel, her movements growing frantic. The socks, the bird, a length of twine, a comb with missing teeth, they all tumbled onto the dirt floor of the lean-to. The satchel was empty. The map was gone. The drumming of the rain seemed to recede, replaced by a roaring in her ears. She stared at the empty bag, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes were seeing. It couldn't be. She had been so careful. No one knew. No one. Her head snapped up. Her eyes, wide with a dawning horror, flew across the small fire to the man sitting in the shadows on the other side of the lean-to. Will. He was sharpening his knife on a whetstone, his movements slow and methodical, his head bent to the task. The firelight cast flickering shadows across the hard planes of his face, making his expression unreadable. Sinister. He had been alone in the camp for hours at a time while he thought she was fetching water or gathering wood. He had mended her saddle. He had handled her belongings. He had been near the satchel 100 times. The trust that had grown so slowly and carefully inside her shattered in an instant, the sound of it as loud and violent in her mind as the storm outside. The quiet moments, the shared meals, his gentleness when he'd tended her foot, it all curdled, transforming from acts of kindness into a calculated, cruel deception. He had been playing her, earning her trust, waiting for the right moment to steal the one thing she had. Why, for Thorne's money, had he been one of his men all along? A different kind of hunter, one who used patience instead of guns. The thought was a venomous serpent, sinking its fangs deep into her heart. The pain of it was a physical agony, far worse than any bruise or scar. It was the pain of absolute betrayal. Her voice, when she spoke, was unrecognizable, a low, guttural sound torn from the depths of her rage and despair. "Where is it?" Will's hand stilled on the knife. He looked up, his gray eyes narrowed slightly, questioning. "Where is what?" "Don't!" she hissed, the word sharp as broken glass. She scrambled to her feet, the contents of her satchel lying forgotten in the mud. "Don't you play the fool with me. The map, my map. Where is it?" He rose slowly to his feet, placing the knife and stone carefully on a rock beside him. He faced her across the fire, his expression still a mask of shadows. His silence, the silence that had once been her shield, was now a confession. It was the silence of guilt. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Liar!" The word was a scream, torn from her throat. Tears of rage and betrayal streamed down her face, hot against her cold skin. "You took it while I slept. While I was away, you were waiting, weren't you? All of it, the coffee, the blanket, patching my foot, it was all a lie. A trick to get me to trust you." He took a step toward her, his hands held open at his sides. "Clara! Don't you say my name!" she shrieked, stumbling backward, away from him, out from under the meager protection of the lean-to and into the driving rain. The cold deluge plastered her hair to her face and soaked her thin dress in seconds. But she didn't feel it. The fire in her chest was burning too hot. "You're one of them. You're one of Thorne's men." He stopped, his face hardening at the accusation. For the first time, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not anger, but a deep, profound hurt. But to her, in her rage, it looked like the frustration of a man whose game was up. "That's not true," he said, his voice a low growl. "Then where is the map?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "It was all I had. It was my only chance, and you took it. You sold me out for a few dollars." He didn't answer. He just stood there, a stone wall of silence, letting her accusations rain down on him. What could he say? He hadn't taken it, but he couldn't prove it. Any denial would sound like another lie. And so he stood silent, and his silence condemned him. It was the final, damning proof. A sob of pure agony escaped her. The one person she had allowed herself to believe in had betrayed her more completely than any other. The world was exactly as she had always known it to be, a place of predators and prey, with no room for trust. "I hate you," she whispered, the words barely audible above the storm. Then, fueled by a grief so profound it felt like insanity, she turned and ran. She scrambled through the slick, red mud, past the sputtering fire, toward the horses. She fumbled with the knot on her gelding's reins, her fingers numb and clumsy. She could feel his eyes on her back, but he didn't move to stop her. His stillness was the final act of cruelty. He was letting her go. He had what he wanted. He didn't need her anymore. She threw herself onto the horse's back, kicking its ribs with her heels, and plunged out of the relative safety of the canyon and into the howling, black chaos of the storm. The world dissolved into a blinding fury of wind and water. Rain lashed at her face, stinging her eyes, and the wind tore at her clothes, trying to rip her from the saddle. The horse, terrified, slipped and stumbled on the unseen ground. Clara didn't care. She rode blindly, aimlessly, wanting only to put as much distance as possible between herself and the man in the canyon. She was running from his betrayal, from the devastating ruin of her own fragile hope. Miles behind her, Will Creed stood in the rain for a long time, watching the spot where she had disappeared. Then, with a grim set to his jaw, he turned, saddled Dusty, and followed. He did not try to catch her. He kept his distance, a phantom in the storm, a silent, trailing shadow. He would not force her back, but he would not let her face the darkness alone. For hours, Clara rode until the horse was trembling with exhaustion and she was numb with cold and despair. The storm began to abate, the torrential downpour lessening to a steady, miserable drizzle. A sliver of moon appeared through a break in the clouds, casting a weak, ghostly light over the sodden landscape. She found herself in a narrow, wooded ravine, the trees offering some small shelter from the wind. She slid from the saddle, her legs barely able to hold her, leaning against the horse's shivering flank. She finally let the sobs come. Great, wrenching gasps of pain that tore at her throat. She had never felt so utterly, hopelessly alone. A twig snapped nearby. Her head shot up, her hand instinctively going to the revolver still tucked in her waistband. She peered into the gloom, her heart hammering against her ribs. A figure emerged from the shadows of the trees. It was not Will. This man was slighter, with a narrow, fox-like face and small, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He wore a long, oilskin duster, and he moved with a quiet, deliberate grace. He wasn't one of the thugs from the rock formation. This man was different. He was a professional. He held up a hand, palm open. "Easy now, miss, no need for that." His eyes flickered down to the gun in her hand, then back to her face. A slow, knowing smile spread across his lips. "You're a hard one to track, I'll give you that, especially in this weather. But Thorne pays well for persistence." The name was a punch to the gut. Clara's blood ran cold. The man took another step forward, into a patch of moonlight, and she saw what he was holding in his other hand. It was a piece of paper, protected from the rain by a sheet of oilskin. He was looking down at it, studying it in the faint light. He held it up, a triumphant gleam in his foxy eyes. "This is a curious thing," he said, his voice conversational, almost pleasant. "A map to an old, played-out claim, Red Hollow. Now, why would a man like Elias Thorne be so interested in a place like this? And why would he pay me a fortune to get it back, along with the girl who stole it?" Clara stared at the paper, and the last of the strength went out of her. She recognized it instantly. The distinctive fold in the top corner, the slight water stain near the bottom, the crudely drawn symbol of a canyon that marked Red Hollow. It was her map. The bounty hunter held her map. The horrifying, soul-crushing reality of it crashed down upon her. Will hadn't just stolen it. He had passed it on. He had led this man to her. The warning shot, the fight, the lean-to, the shared meals, the gentle care, it had all been an elaborate, monstrous lie. He hadn't been protecting her. He had been guarding his investment until the buyer arrived. The bounty hunter smiled again. "Your silent friend was very accommodating, drove a hard bargain, but a deal's a deal." The world tilted on its axis, and a black, roaring emptiness opened up inside Clara. The pain was so immense, so absolute. It was beyond tears. It was the death of hope. It was the final, undeniable proof that she was, and always would be, utterly alone. The bounty hunter's words were a poison that paralyzed her from the inside out. Your silent friend was very accommodating. The lie was so monstrous, so complete, that it hollowed out the world, leaving only a cold, silent void where Clara's heart had been. The star revolver in her hand felt like a child's toy, a meaningless lump of iron. The fight had been leached from her bones, replaced by a despair so profound it was a physical weight, pressing her down into the mud. The man, Silas Finn, saw the light go out in her eyes. He saw the fight collapse. This was the part of the job he savored, not the chase. But the moment the prey understood the trap was not just around them, but had been inside them all along. "He didn't make it easy, mind you," Finn continued, his voice a smooth, conversational venom. He took a step closer. Clara didn't move. "I'd been tracking you for a day, found your little hideaway in the canyon, waited for the storm, snuck in while you two were huddled in that pathetic lean-to and took the map right out of your bag. Your man slept like a log." He paused, letting the lie sink in. When he found it was gone, he was smart enough to know the game was up, rode out, found my tracks. We had a little chat. He drives a hard bargain, I'll say that for him. Half my fee up front. It was a masterpiece of cruelty, a story designed to break her completely. And it worked. Clara didn't even flinch when he moved with a snake's speed, his hand shooting out to wrench the revolver from her grasp. She barely registered the cold press of his own pistol against her temple or the rough scrape of rope as he bound her wrists tightly behind her back. She was a ghost, a hollowed-out shell of a girl being led through the drizzling rain by her captor. He took them to a shallow cave set into the base of a rocky bluff, a place that stank of wet earth and old ash. It was little more than an overhang, but it was dry. He shoved her to the ground on the sandy floor and built a small, smokeless fire from the dry wood he had stashed there. He worked with an unhurried, professional calm, occasionally glancing at her with his cold, intelligent eyes. She was cargo, a problem that was now solved. Clara lay on her side, the rough sand pressing into her cheek. The cold from the damp ground seeped into her, but she barely felt it. All she could feel was the echoing emptiness inside her. She replayed every moment in the canyon. Will's hands mending her saddle, the way he had looked at her when he pulled the splinter from her foot, the silent offering of the blanket. Each memory was now a fresh torment, a testament to her own foolishness. He had never been her protector. He had been her warden, guarding her until the real owner came to claim his property. The pain was so sharp, so complete, that she wished Jebediah's bullet had found her back at the first rock formation. Finn ate a piece of hardtack, chewing methodically. "Thorne's other men will be meeting me here by morning," he said, more to himself than to her. "They'll be pleased. He wants you back, undamaged." The way he said the word made her skin crawl, but even that felt distant, a threat to a body she'd no longer inhabited. Hours passed. The fire burned down to a pile of glowing red embers, casting a faint, demonic light on the cave walls. Finn, confident his captive was too broken to be a threat, eventually leaned his head back against a rock, his rifle across his lap, and closed his eyes. The steady drizzle outside was the only sound. It was a scuff of a boot on stone that broke the spell, a sound so faint it was almost nothing. But it was a sound that did not belong to the night. Finn's eyes snapped open. He started to bring his rifle up. A shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows at the mouth of the cave. It moved with a speed that was not human. There was no shout, no warning. There was only the blur of movement, a glint of steel in the dying firelight, and a choked, wet gasp from Silas Finn. The bounty hunter slumped sideways, his rifle clattering onto the sand. He made no other sound. The shadow straightened up. For a moment, it was just a dark, menacing silhouette against the mouth of the cave. Then it took a step forward into the faint red glow of the embers. It was Will. Clara's mind fractured. It was impossible. It couldn't be him. He had sold her. He had betrayed her. Yet here he was, standing over the body of the man he had supposedly made a deal with, a long, dark knife dripping in his hand. Before she could process the contradiction, a voice shouted from the darkness outside, "Finn, that you!" It was Jebediah. Will didn't hesitate. He lunged toward Clara, his knife flashing as he sawed through the ropes binding her wrists. The instant her hands were free, he pressed the cold, heavy grip of his own Colt into her palm. "Stay back," he rasped, his voice a low growl of pure menace. He spun around, dropping into a low crouch behind the rock Finn had been leaning against. Just as the night exploded, a muzzle flash from the entrance of the cave lit the scene in a stark, instantaneous photograph. Jebediah, his face a mask of fury, a pistol bucking in his hand, behind him. The younger, nervous gunman from before. The bullet whined off the rock face, showering Will with stone fragments. Will fired back. The roar of his Colt was deafening in the enclosed space. The cave was plunged back into absolute darkness, the acrid smell of gunpowder stinging Clara's nostrils. A scream from outside told him his shot had found a mark. "He's in the cave," Jebediah roared. "Light him up!" Another muzzle flash, this one from a slightly different angle. The bullet thudded into Finn's body, which lay between them. Clara, her back pressed against the cold, damp stone at the rear of the cave, could do nothing but watch the terrifying fireworks display. The world was a series of blinding flashes and deafening roars. In those split-second moments of light, she saw Will, moving, firing, a phantom of focused violence. She saw the rage and confusion on Jebediah's face. This was not the careful, patient man who had fired a warning shot. This was the soldier. This was a man fighting in the dark, fighting for his life, fighting for her life. The lie Finn had told her began to crumble, the logic of it falling apart in the face of the brutal reality unfolding before her eyes. Why would he be here? Why would he fight them if he had already been paid? A bullet ricocheted off the cave wall near her head, and she screamed. A raw, terrified sound. The sound drew their fire. Another flash was aimed directly at her. Will moved. He threw himself sideways, out from behind his cover, firing 2 shots in quick succession. He put himself between her and the gunfire. The first shot went wide, but the second caught the younger gunman in the chest. The man let out a surprised grunt and crumpled to the ground without another sound. Jebediah, enraged, fired wildly into the cave. In the strobing light of the gunshots, Clara saw Will stumble. He grunted, a sharp exhalation of pain, and fell to one knee. He tried to raise his pistol again, but his arm wavered. He was hit. The sight of him falling, of his strength failing, broke through the last vestiges of Clara's paralysis. The hollow, dead thing inside her chest roared back to life. A savage, protective fire. The despair was burned away by a hot, white-hot fury. Jebediah, seeing his chance, charged into the cave, his pistol leveled at the kneeling figure of Will. Clara raised the heavy Colt Will had given her. She had never fired a gun in her life, except for the one wild shot that had missed Thorn. Now, her hands, which had trembled so violently before, were rock steady. She didn't aim. She just pointed it at the dark, charging shape and pulled the trigger. The recoil was a brutal shock, jolting her arm all the way to the shoulder. The shot was deafening. In the brief, brilliant flash, she saw Jebediah jerk to a halt, his eyes wide with surprise, a dark, blossoming stain appearing on his shirt. He staggered backward, tripped over his fallen comrade, and fell out of the cave entrance. Silent. The silence that followed was absolute, a ringing, profound emptiness. The only sounds were the faint patter of the rain outside and a low, ragged sound from the darkness in front of her. It was the sound of someone trying to breathe through unimaginable pain. "Will," she whispered, her voice trembling. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, the warm, sticky sand telling her where the blood was. She found him slumped against the rock, his head bowed. His shirt was soaked on his left side, just below the ribs. "Will," she said again, her hand finding his shoulder. He was shaking, his body racked with tremors. He looked up, his face pale and slick with sweat in the faint glow of the embers. "You need to go," he gasped, his voice thin. "Before others." "No," she said. The word was flat, absolute. "I'm not leaving you." "The bounty hunter, Finn," Will rasped, forcing the words out. "He was at the canyon. While you were gone, during the storm. He got the map. Told me Thorn would pay for you and the map." A spasm of pain racked his body. "I followed him." The truth was so simple, so plain. Finn hadn't lied about getting the map. He had only lied about who his accomplice was. He had twisted the truth into a weapon to break her spirit. And it had almost worked. "Hush now," she said, her voice softening, though her hands were firm. She helped him lie back, his head resting in her lap. The wound was bad, a dark, ugly hole weeping blood. "We need to stop the bleeding. We need to get the bullet out." "No time," he whispered, his eyes fluttering. "We're making time," she commanded. She tore a long strip from the hem of her dress and pressed it hard against the wound. He cried out, a raw, guttural sound, and she flinched, but she didn't lessen the pressure. She could feel it then, just under the surface, a hard, unyielding lump beneath the muscle. The bullet. It hadn't gone clean through. She looked around the dark cave. There was nothing, no tools, no whiskey to clean the wound. Nothing but rock and sand and the bodies of the dead. She looked down at her own hands, covered in his blood. They were all she had. "This is going to hurt. Will," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "Bite on this." She ripped another piece of cloth and pushed it between his teeth. He looked at her, his eyes clouded with pain but clear with a dawning understanding. He saw the girl who had trembled in the rocks was gone. In her place was a woman made of fire and steel. He bit down on the cloth and nodded. Clara took a deep, shuddering breath. She pushed 2 fingers into the hot, slick wound. Ignoring his muffled groan of agony, she followed the track of the bullet, her fingers probing through torn muscle and sticky blood. It was a brutal, intimate violation, an act of desperate, savage healing. She felt the hard, misshapen piece of lead lodged against a rib. Her fingers closed around it, and with a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, she pulled. Will's entire body arched in a silent scream, for a moment that stretched into eternity. The bullet resisted, caught on bone and tissue. Then, with a sickening squelch, it came free. She held it in her palm, a small, warm, heavy piece of metal that had almost taken his life. She threw it aside and immediately pressed the wad of cloth back into the wound. Applying all her weight, Will had gone limp, his body slack, his breathing shallow. He was unconscious, or worse. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm her. She leaned down, her ear close to his lips, and felt a faint, warm puff of air. He was still breathing. She held the makeshift bandage in place. Tears she hadn't realized she was crying now streaming down her face, washing paths through the grime and blood on her cheeks. She was alone in a dark cave with 3 dead men and the one man who had, against all odds, come back for her. He was dying in her arms. She leaned her head down, her lips close to his ear, and whispered into the darkness. Her voice was a fierce, ragged, desperate prayer. "Don't you leave me," she said, her voice cracking. "Not after this." The first thing Will knew was pain. It was a dull, hot, insistent thing. A live coal buried in his side. It was the anchor that pulled him up from a deep, black, silent ocean. The second thing he knew was thirst, a rasping dryness in his throat that felt like a lifetime of dust. The third thing was a sound, soft and rhythmic, the gentle hiss of a damp cloth on a hot forehead. His eyelids were heavy as stones, but he forced them open. The world was a blur of brown and green, out of focus. He was not in the cave. The air didn't stink of blood and gunpowder. It smelled of pine needles, damp earth, and wood smoke. He was on his back, on his own bedroll, tucked into the corner of the lean-to they had built. A thick wool blanket, the one he had given her, was drawn up to his chin. The soft hissing sound came again. A figure moved in the blur, and the world slowly resolved itself into focus. It was Clara. She was kneeling beside him, her face pale and drawn in the soft light filtering into the shelter. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her hair was a wild tangle, but her expression was one of fierce, unwavering concentration. She held a strip of cloth, dipped in a tin cup of water, and was carefully, gently wiping the sweat and grime from his face. He tried to speak, but all that came out was a dry, broken croak. Instantly, she set the cloth aside. She shifted, propping his head and shoulders up with a surprising strength. She held the tin cup to his lips, and the water that trickled into his mouth was the coldest, purest thing he had ever tasted. He drank greedily, the water soothing the fire in his throat. When he was done, she lowered him back down gently. His eyes scanned the small camp. The fire was burning low and steady just outside the lean-to. Their meager possessions were arranged in a neat, orderly fashion. The horses were nowhere in sight, but he could hear the soft nicker of his mare, Dusty, from deeper in the canyon. She had managed it all. She had dealt with the bodies in the cave, loaded him onto his own horse, an impossible task for someone her size, and brought him back to this small sanctuary. The sheer force of will it must have taken was staggering. He looked back at her. Her gaze was fixed on the wound in his side. The bandage was a thick pad made of strips torn from her own dress, clean and tightly bound. There was no sign of fresh bleeding. They did not speak of the cave. The night of fire and thunder, of blood on the sand, was a chasm that lay between them, a shared nightmare that words could not touch. To speak of it would be to give it a power they could not afford. It existed, it had happened, and they had survived it. That was all. For 3 days, the world was confined to the small space of the lean-to. Time was measured not by the sun, but by the rhythm of Clara's care. She was not a gentle or sentimental nurse. Her movements were born of grim necessity, efficient and sometimes rough. She would change his dressing with a firm hand that bespoke a refusal to be squeamish. She boiled water from the spring and cleaned the wound with a relentless focus that was both painful and healing. She hunted using the star revolver he had given back to her, and returned with a rabbit or a brace of quail, which she would stew into a thin, hot broth that she spoon-fed him. Will, a man who had not been dependent on anyone since he was a boy, learned the difficult art of acceptance. He let her tend to him. When a fever took him, and the black ocean threatened to pull him under again, he surrendered to her cool hands on his face and the sound of her voice. A low, steady murmur that was not any particular words, but just a sound of presence, a human anchor in the delirium. He watched her. He saw the exhaustion etched into the lines of her face, but he also saw a new and profound stillness in her. The frightened, trembling girl from the rock crevice was gone, burned away in the fire of that terrible night. The angry, betrayed woman who had fled into the storm was gone, too. In their place was this person, quiet, capable, and present. She moved with a sense of purpose, of belonging. She was no longer just surviving. She was presiding. On the 4th day, the fever broke. He woke to a clear head and a clean, sharp pain in his side that was a welcome friend after the muddy confusion of the infection. He was weak, but he was himself again. Clara was sitting by the fire, her back to him, mending his torn shirt with the small needle and thread, the same shirt she had mended once before. He pushed himself up into a sitting position, a wave of dizziness making the canyon walls swim for a moment. She heard the movement and turned, her expression unreadable. She rose and came to him, not with a cup of water, but with a piece of hardtack, the last of their supplies. She broke it in half and handed him a piece. He took it. They ate their meager meal in silence, their eyes meeting over the small fire. It was a communion, a sharing of bread that acknowledged everything without saying anything. It was an admission of a shared life, a shared breath. The space between them was no longer filled with suspicion or caution. It was filled with the quiet, unshakable weight of what they had endured together. A simple nod from him was a thank you that encompassed the whole world. A slight inclination of her head was an acknowledgement that said it was necessary. Later that day, she brought water and helped him wash. She tended to his other wounds, the scrapes and bruises from the fight. Her touch was clinical, impersonal. Yet the simple act of her hands on his skin was a form of communication more profound than any words. It spoke of care, of a shared humanity that had been stripped down to its most essential element. He was a wounded man, and she was the one who was keeping him alive. That evening, the air was still and cool. A full moon rose over the canyon rim, bathing their small camp in a soft, ethereal silver light. The fire crackled, a warm, orange heart in the cool blue of the night. Will was propped up against his saddle, watching the flames. Clara sat on the other side of the fire, staring into the embers, lost in her own thoughts. The silence stretched, comfortable and deep. It was a silence that was no longer empty. It was full of the unspoken, the understood. It was the silence of home. Clara spoke, her voice so quiet it was almost carried away by the wind. She did not look at him, but continued to stare into the fire, as if the words were being pulled from the glowing coals. "I've been forced to live with someone before," she said, her voice clear and steady, without a trace of self-pity. It was a simple statement of a brutal fact. She spoke of her life at Thorne's Ranch, of the time after her father's death when she was no longer a person but a piece of property, an object to be possessed, a prisoner in all but name. She paused, and in the silence, Will heard everything she wasn't saying. The fear, the helplessness, the slow, grinding erosion of the soul that comes from having no choice. Then she looked up, her gaze lifting from the fire and meeting his across the flames. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were clear and luminous in the moonlight. The fear was gone. The defiance was no longer a desperate, defensive spark, but a calm, steady flame. "But this," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying the weight of a solemn vow. "This is the first time I've chosen to stay." The words settled in the quiet air between them. They were not an accusation, not a plea, not a declaration of affection. They were a declaration of self, a claiming of her own life. She was not staying because she owed him a debt for saving her. She was not staying out of fear of what lay beyond the canyon. She was staying because, for the first time in a long time, she was in a place where her presence was her own decision. She was free, and she was choosing this, choosing him. Will looked at her, at this woman forged in fire and fear, who had pulled a bullet from his body with her bare hands and dragged him back from the edge of death. He saw the strength that had always been there, now unobscured by the terror that had for so long imprisoned it. He understood the profound gift she was giving him. It was not her affection, or her loyalty, or her care. It was her choice. He thought of the long, lonely years on the trail, of the quiet emptiness that had been both his refuge and his prison. He had kept his distance from the world, and the world had kept its distance from him. He had never asked anyone to stay. He had never expected it. His voice, when he answered, was low and rough, filled with an emotion he could not name. "I won't stop you." It was all he could say. It was everything he needed to say. It was not a promise to protect her or a claim to own her. It was a promise to respect her. It was an acknowledgement that her choice was hers alone, and he would be the shield for that choice, not the cage. She held his gaze for a moment longer. A small, almost imperceptible nod, her only reply. Then she looked back into the fire. The choice had been offered. It had been accepted. Nothing else needed to be said. The moon climbed higher in the sky, and the fire burned low. And in the quiet sanctuary of the high canyon, two solitary souls sat together in a silence that was, for the first time, not about survival, but about beginning. The journey to Red Hollow was a slow, deliberate pilgrimage into the heart of the past. Will's wound, though clean and healing well, was a constant, nagging presence. He could ride, but not hard, and each jolt of the horse was a fresh reminder of his own mortality. This reversal of roles settled upon them without a word. It was now Clara who took the lead, her eyes scanning the horizon, her hand never far from the butt of the star revolver. She was the scout, the protector. Will rode beside her, his silence no longer just a habit, but a conservation of strength. They traveled through a land that grew progressively more desolate, as if mirroring the grimness of their purpose. The high, grassy plains gave way to a broken, arid country of deep arroyos and sun-scorched mesas. The earth itself was the color of dried blood, and the wind whispered through skeletal ocotillo and hunched, malevolent-looking cacti. It was a land that held its secrets close. Clara carried the map. She had taken it from the body of Silas Finn, its oilskin protector smeared with his blood. Now, it was a different kind of object. It was no longer a desperate lottery ticket, a flimsy hope for a place of refuge. It was a weapon. It was a key. It was a destination. During the quiet evenings, as Will rested, she would study it by the firelight. It wasn't just a map to a place. She realized now it was a map to the truth. The notations in the margins, the figures scrawled in Thorne's spidery handwriting, they were not geological surveys. They were debts, names, and dates. It was a ledger of his crimes, disguised as a prospector's chart. "He won't expect us to come for him," she said one evening, breaking the long silence. Her voice was steady. Will, who was leaning against his saddle, his face looking worn and pale in the firelight, opened his eyes. "No," he agreed. "He expects you to run. He expects me to be dead." "He'll be there," she continued. Not a question, but a statement of certainty. "This place, Red Hollow, it's important to him. The secrets on this map, they end there. He'll be there to protect them." Will just watched her. He saw the cold, hard knot of resolve in her jaw. The fear was still there. He knew he could see it deep in her eyes, a shadow in the back of the storm. But it was no longer her master. It was a whetstone, sharpening her purpose to a razor's edge. Red Hollow was not a town. It was a scar, a deep, blood-red gash in the earth where men had once torn at the rock in a feverish hunt for silver. Now, it was a ghost. A collection of ruined shacks and weathered headframes clinging to the sides of a narrow box canyon. The wind moaned through the empty window frames, a constant, lonely sound. The place felt dead, haunted by the ghosts of failed ambition and forgotten men. As they approached the canyon mouth, Will held up a hand. "Wait!" He slid from Dusty's back, his movements stiff with pain. "Let me look." He handed her the reins and disappeared into a jumble of rocks, his Winchester held ready. He moved with the slow, painful grace of a wounded wolf, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. Clara waited, her heart a slow, heavy drum in her chest. She was not afraid of what he would find. She knew. She had known since they set out. You do not run from a man like Elias Thorne. You face him, or he will chase you to the edge of the world. Will returned after 10 long minutes, his face grim. "He's here," he said, his voice a low rasp. "In the old assayer's office, at the far end of the canyon. 5 men. They're not hiding. They're waiting." He looked at her, his gray eyes searching her face. "Clara, we can ride away. We can go north. Keep going until he can't find us." It was an offer, a final chance to choose the path of the survivor, the runner. He was giving her the choice he had promised her in the moonlight. She looked past him, down the dusty, wind-swept gulch that was Red Hollow's only street. She saw the skeletal remains of the buildings, the dark, waiting maw of the assayer's office. She thought of her father, of the scars on her shoulder, of the terror in the night. She thought of the blood Will had shed for her in the dark cave. Running was a kind of death. It was a promise to always be afraid. "No," she said, her voice quiet but absolute. She slid from her horse's back. "It ends here." Will held her gaze for a long moment, and then he gave a single, slow nod. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, not pride, not approval, but a deep, quiet understanding. He had offered her an escape, and she had chosen the battlefield. He took his rifle. "I'll find a high spot. The old smithy on the east wall. I can cover you from there." "No," she said again. He stopped, turning back to her, a question in his eyes. "This is my fight, Will," she said, her voice gaining strength. "He's not here for you. He's here for me. I have to be the one to face him." She touched the revolver tucked in her waistband. "You just be there, be my shadow, but let me walk the street." It was the hardest thing he had ever been asked to do. Every instinct, every fiber of his being screamed at him to go first, to be the shield, to take the bullets. But he looked at her face, at the unshakable resolve in her eyes, and he understood. This wasn't about his need to protect. It was about her need to be whole, to save her. He had to let her walk toward the guns. "All right," he breathed, the word torn from him. "I'll be there." Clara took a deep breath, the dusty air filling her lungs. She handed him the reins to her horse and started walking. She walked down the middle of the street, her worn boots kicking up little puffs of red dust. The wind whipped her hair across her face and flattened her dress against her legs. But she did not falter. Her back was straight. Her head was high. Her hands, swinging loosely at her sides, were steady. She did not tremble. The door of the assayer's office opened. Elias Thorne stepped out onto the warped porch, flanked by 2 of his men. 3 more appeared from the alleyways between the ruined shacks, their hands hovering over their holsters. They formed a loose, menacing semicircle, trapping her. Thorne was a big man, built of thick muscle and self-importance. He wore a fine black coat, even in the heat, and a planter's hat that shaded a face florid with anger and bruised pride. He looked at her not as a person, but as a particularly stubborn piece of livestock that had broken its fence. "Clara!" he boomed, his voice oozing a false, paternal disappointment. "This foolishness has gone on long enough. You have caused a great deal of trouble. Men have been hurt. It is time for you to come home." Clara stopped 20 paces from him. She could smell the stale whiskey on his breath, even from this distance. She saw the possessive gleam in his eyes, the absolute certainty that he was in the right. "I am not your property, Mr. Thorne," she said. Her voice was not a shout. It was clear and cold as river stone, and it carried down the silent street, cutting through the moan of the wind. Thorne's face tightened, the paternal mask slipping. "You are my ward. Your father entrusted you to my care. You will show me respect. You will be my wife." "I am not your ward," she stated, each word a carefully placed stone building a wall he could not breach. "And I will not be your wife. I am not a stray to be hunted down and brought back to your pen." A dark, dangerous fury began to burn in Thorne's eyes. He had been challenged, humiliated, in public. "You are a foolish, ungrateful girl," he snarled. "You belong to me. You will learn your place." He took a step forward, his hand raising as if to command her. And then the shadow moved. From the deep darkness of a ruined livery stable to Clara's right, Will Creed stepped out. He did not emerge with a swagger or a shout. He simply appeared, a phantom in the afternoon sun, his long duster hanging on his lean frame. The Winchester was held loosely in the crook of his arm, its barrel pointing at the ground. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, slightly behind her and to her right, his feet planted, his gray eyes as cold and flat as a winter sky. His presence was a physical force. It shifted the balance of the entire street. He was a promise of violence held in reserve, an equal and opposite force to Thorne's blustering power. He was her shadow, and he had come to rest right behind her. Thorne stopped dead, his eyes flicking from Clara to the silent man who had appeared from nowhere. He recognized him then. From the descriptions his wounded men had given him, the quiet man, the marksman. "So," Thorne sneered, trying to recover his bravado, "this is the dog you've taken up with? A hired gun?" "He's not a hired gun," Clara said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "He's a free man, and so am I." It was the final declaration. The line had been drawn in the red dust of the dead town. Thorne's face contorted, his pride shattered, his authority rendered meaningless. All he had left was the brute force he had always relied on. He looked at his men, his voice a low, vicious command. "Take them!" The air grew thick, heavy with the seconds stretching into an eternity. A man to the left licked his lips. Another shifted his weight, the leather of his gun belt creaking. It was the sound of death clearing its throat. Will raised the Winchester, the movement so smooth and economical it was barely a motion at all. The butt of the rifle settled against his shoulder, his cheek against the worn wood. He was no longer a shadow. He was the thunder, waiting for the lightning. Thorne's hand dropped to his own pistol. "Now!" he roared. The world dissolved into the deafening language of gunpowder and blood. Thorne's roar of "now" was swallowed by the immediate, concussive reply of Will's Winchester. The world did not so much dissolve into chaos as it was brutally clarified by it. The gunfight was not a prolonged, dramatic affair. It was a swift, ugly piece of business, over in less than 10 heartbeats. Will's first shot was a statement. It took the man on Thorne's right, a known killer named Marcus, high in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him in a heap before he had even cleared his holster. The second shot worked with the smooth, practiced motion of the rifle's lever action, tore a chunk of wood from the porch post near Thorne's head, a deliberate, terrifying near miss that made the big man flinch and duck. In that half-second of hesitation, Clara stood her ground. She did not fire. The Star revolver remained at her side, a heavy, cold weight of potential. Her battle was not this one. This was Will's domain, a terrible, violent language he spoke with fluent finality. Her war would be won with words. The other men, seeing Marcus fall and Thorne cower, had their courage tested and found wanting. They were hired guns, paid for intimidation, not for a fair fight against a man who moved like a ghost and shot like a demon. One man fired a wild, panicked shot that went nowhere near its target before turning and scrambling for the cover of a ruined shack. The others simply melted away into the alleyways, their loyalty dissolving in the face of a fight they could not win. Thorne, enraged and alone, finally managed to draw his own ornate pistol. He brought it up, his face a mask of purple fury, and leveled it at Clara. She was the source of his humiliation, the root of this rebellion. He never fired. A third shot from the Winchester cracked the afternoon silence. It did not hit his chest or his head. It struck his gun hand, shattering the bone with a sound like a dry branch snapping. The pistol flew from his grasp, and he let out a great, bellowing cry of agony. Clutching his ruined hand to his chest, he staggered backward, his face a mess of shock and pain, and collapsed onto the steps of the assayer's office. And then, silence. A profound, ringing silence broken only by the moan of the wind and Thorne's pathetic, gasping sobs of pain. The dust settled, the scent of gunpowder, sharp and metallic, hung heavy in the air. Will stepped out from the cover of the livery stable, the Winchester held low, his eyes scanning the empty street, ensuring the threat was truly gone. He moved with a slight limp, his side a dull, hot ache, but his focus was absolute. He saw the other gunman had fled, and his gaze finally settled on the whimpering form of Elias Thorne. Clara walked forward slowly, her boots stirring the red dust. She did not look at the fallen gunman or the dark stain spreading on the porch. She walked until she stood before the man who had tried to own her. He looked up at her, his eyes wild with pain and disbelief. No longer a titan of the valley, but just a broken, bleeding man. She did not raise her gun. Instead, She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out the folded, blood-stained map. She let the oilskin fall away and carefully unfolded the paper, its creases worn and soft. "This is what this was all about, isn't it?" she said, her voice clear and steady. "Not me. This." She held up the map. Thorne's eyes widened, a new kind of fear replacing the pain. "This isn't a map to a silver claim," Clara continued, her voice gaining the cadence of a pronouncement. "It's your memory, your secret history." She ran a finger along a spidery line of Thorne's own handwriting. "Jedediah Stone," she read aloud. "Loan for seed, spring of 72, foreclosed, fall of 72. I remember Mr. Stone. His ranch bordered yours to the north. He died that winter. A hunting accident, they said, and his land became your land." She moved her finger to another entry. "Silas Croft, water rights agreement, voided, summer of 74. Mr. Croft's well went dry. Didn't it after you diverted the creek? He had to sell his herd to you for pennies on the dollar and move his family away." She did not need to shout. Her quiet, damning words were more powerful than any bullet. She was not just accusing him. She was erasing him, dismantling the myth of the powerful rancher, the valley patriarch, and revealing the petty, grasping tyrant beneath. "There are other names here," she said, her eyes boring into his. "Men who died in accidents, men whose land you stole, men whose families you broke. This map, this is your soul, Mr. Thorne, and it's as empty and ruined as this town." She had won. The realization settled over her, not with a sense of triumph, but with a profound, quiet finality. Her victory had not come from the thunder of a gun, but from the quiet power of the truth. She had faced her monster, and she had not flinched. She had spoken his crimes into the open air, and he had crumbled. It was at that moment that the law finally arrived. A lone rider, a star glinting on his dusty vest, trotted his horse down the street, his eyes taking in the scene with a weary professionalism. He was a U.S. Marshal, a man named Fates, whose territory was too large and whose resources were too few. He had been tracking Thorne's hired guns for weeks, always a step behind. He dismounted, his gaze moving from the fallen man on the porch to the whimpering Thorne, to Will standing like a silent sentinel, and finally to the young woman holding a piece of paper like a verdict. "Looks like I missed the party," Marshal Fates said, his voice as dry as the dust under his boots. Thorne, seeing the badge, tried to rally. "Marshal, thank God this man," he gasped, pointing a trembling finger at Will. "And this runaway girl, they attacked me, they've murdered my men." The marshal looked at Will, who remained silent, his rifle pointed at the ground. Then he looked at Clara. He saw no fear in her, no guilt. He saw an unnerving calm. "Is that so, Miss?" Fates asked, his eyes shrewd. Clara simply held out the map. "His ledger," she said. "Read the names, then go ask their widows." Fates took the map. He scanned the entries, his eyebrows rising slightly. He had heard the stories, the rumors that had clung to Thorne for years like the valley mist, but he had never had proof. He looked from the paper to the man bleeding on the steps. The pieces clicked into place. "Elias Thorne," the marshal said, his voice flat and official. "I've got a stack of warrants for the men you hire. Looks like I can add your name to the list for a few things as well." He took out a pair of handcuffs. The chase was over. The law, slow and ponderous, had finally caught up. The journey back to the high canyon was quiet. The oppressive, desolate landscape that had seemed so menacing on the way to Red Hollow now felt different. It felt open, vast, full of possibility. The wind no longer sounded like a mournful ghost. It sounded like a cleansing breath, sweeping away the past. They rode side by side, the silence between them easy and comfortable. Will's wound ached, but it was a healing ache. a reminder of survival, not of defeat. He watched Clara as she rode. The reins held loosely in her hands. The tension was gone from her shoulders. The haunted look was gone from her eyes. She looked younger, and at the same time, ageless. She looked free. They made camp that night under a vast, star-dusted sky. They shared a meal of coffee and the last of the rabbit she had hunted. They sat by the fire, the easy silence stretching between them, a bridge built of shared experience. Will looked at her, at the way the firelight caught the red highlights in her tangled hair. He thought of his life before he'd found her in the rocks. A long, straight, lonely line across an empty map. She had been a detour, a complication, a storm that had torn his solitary world apart. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he could never go back to that empty map. But he also knew he had no right to ask her to stay on his. He had promised her a choice. "Where will you go now?" he asked, his voice low and rough. He looked out at the dark, empty horizon. Not at her. "The law has Thorn. You're free. You can go anywhere. California, maybe, or back east." He was offering her the world. He was offering her an escape from this harsh land, from the memories, from him. It was the most difficult and the most necessary gift he could give her. Clara was quiet for a long moment. She poked at the fire with a stick, sending a shower of bright orange sparks up into the darkness. She had heard the unspoken question beneath his words. She had felt the weight of the freedom he was offering her. She could leave. She could start a new life where no one knew her name, where the ghosts of Elias Thorne and the red dust of the desert couldn't find her. She thought of that life, a clean, empty slate, and she realized, with a sudden, startling clarity, that she didn't want it. A blank page was safe, but it was also empty. Her page was not blank anymore. It was scarred and bloody and messy, but it was hers, and it was a story she was writing with him. She looked up from the fire, a small, slow smile touching her lips for the first time. It was a smile that transformed her face. Chasing away the last of the shadows, she turned her head and looked directly at him, her gray eyes clear and bright in the firelight. "Back to the ranch," she said, her voice soft, but with a note of gentle, teasing humor. Will turned to look at her, confused. "The ranch. Our ranch," she clarified, with a slight nod toward the direction of their hidden canyon. Then she added, her smile widening just a little, "I still haven't finished mending your shirt." Will stared at her. Her answer was so simple, so unexpected, so utterly perfect. It wasn't a promise of forever. It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something far better. It was a statement of the present, a choice to continue the small, mundane, beautiful life they had started to build together, a life of mending shirts and sharing coffee, of quiet mornings and silent understanding. It was a promise to go home. A slow warmth spread through his chest, chasing away the last of the cold, lonely years. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, he let himself see not just the survivor, but the woman who had chosen to stay. A slow smile, a rare and unfamiliar thing, touched his own lips. He gave a single nod. It was all the answer she needed. The fire crackled, the stars wheeled overhead, and in the heart of the vast, empty desert, two people turned their faces toward home. They returned to the high canyon not as fugitives, but as homesteaders returning to a claim. The lean-to, which had once seemed a desperate, temporary shelter, now felt like the foundation of a home. The red dust of Red Hollow was washed from their clothes and their memories, replaced by the clean, sharp scent of pine and the familiar trickle of the spring. The world outside the canyon, with its bounty hunters and its broken laws, ceased to exist. Their universe was now defined by the sheltering rock walls, the whisper of the wind through the piñón trees, and the steady, quiet presence of each other. The first change was the garden. One day, Clara returned from a walk not with a rabbit or firewood, but with her dress gathered up in her arms, full of uprooted wildflowers. She found a patch of earth near the spring that caught the morning sun, and, using a flattened piece of wood as a trowel, she began to plant them. There were Indian paintbrushes, their tips a fiery scarlet, delicate bluebonnets, and the cheerful, stubborn yellow of desert marigolds. It was an act of defiant beauty, a splash of soft color against the harshness of the landscape. Will watched her from a distance, saying nothing. But that evening he diverted a small, steady trickle from the spring to water her new garden. The next change was the walls. The lean-to had kept out the worst of the wind, but with the first bite of autumn in the air, they both knew it would not be enough to see them through a winter on the high plains. One morning, Will took his axe and walked into the small forest of pines that dotted the canyon. He returned not with firewood, but with 2 straight, sturdy logs, stripped of their branches. He laid them on the ground, the beginnings of a foundation. Building the cabin became their shared language. There was no architect, no plan on paper, only a mutual understanding that grew between them. Will, with his raw strength and patient knowledge of woodcraft, would fell the trees and notch the logs. His wound was a constant, dull ache, a reminder to pace himself. And Clara became his second set of hands, his partner in the labor. She would help him roll the heavy logs into place, her slight frame belying a wiry strength born of hardship. She learned to mix a slurry of mud and grass to chink the gaps between the logs, her hands caked in the red earth. They worked from sunup to sundown, and in the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sore and exhausted, and watch their home take shape. They were building more than a shelter. They were building a life, log by log, one hard-won day at a time. The cabin was small, just one room with a packed earth floor and a stone fireplace Will built with a craftsman's care. It had one window, facing east to catch the sunrise, and a door made of 3 thick planks of wood bound with strips of deer hide. It was not a house. It was a fortress of solitude for 2. The day they moved their bedrolls and meager possessions from the lean-to into the finished cabin, a sense of profound, quiet peace settled over them. That night, as the wind howled outside, they lay in the warmth and security of the walls they had built together, the fire casting a soft, flickering glow on the rough-hewn logs. It was the first time Clara had slept under a roof that she was not a prisoner in. It was the first time Will had slept under a roof he had any intention of returning to the next day. Life settled into a new rhythm, one dictated by the seasons. Will hunted, his strength slowly returning, his limp fading until it was barely noticeable. He built a small corral for the horses and then began on a fence. Not a fence to keep things out, but a fence to define their space, to mark a small piece of the vast, wild world as their own. He worked with the same steady, silent purpose he did everything else. His axe strokes a steady, rhythmic heartbeat in the canyon. Clara made the cabin a home. She found wild herbs to flavor their stews, and she learned to bake a dense, flat bread on a hot stone by the fire. She mended their clothes until the patches themselves had patches, a testament to their shared history. The wildflowers she had planted took root and flourished, a riot of color by the cabin door that seemed to laugh in the face of the unforgiving landscape. They rarely spoke of the past. It was a closed book, a story that had ended in the red dust of a ghost town. But it was always there, a silent foundation upon which their new life was built. Sometimes, Clara would wake from a nightmare, a choked cry in her throat, and Will would be there, a steady, warm presence in the darkness, his hand finding hers until her trembling subsided. And sometimes, Will would stand at the canyon rim for hours, staring out at the empty horizon, his face a mask of old sorrows, and Clara would simply bring him a cup of coffee, a silent offering of companionship that asked for nothing in return. Their intimacy was a quiet, slow-growing thing, as patient and tenacious as the wildflowers by the door. It was not in grand declarations, but in small, everyday gestures. It was in the way he would leave the best piece of meat for her without a word. It was in the way she would have a hot cup of coffee waiting for him when he came in from the cold. It was in the shared glance across the small room. A silent communication that spoke volumes. They were two solitary people who had, against all odds, learned to share a silence. One night, deep in the winter, a storm blew in. A blizzard that buried the canyon in a thick blanket of white and trapped them inside the cabin for days. The world outside ceased to exist, and their universe shrank to the four-log walls and the steady, roaring heart of the fire. On the third morning of the storm, Clara woke before dawn. The cabin was dark, the only light the faint, pulsating red glow from the embers in the fireplace. The wind shrieked outside, a wild, lonely sound. Will lay sleeping beside her on their shared pallet of pine boughs and blankets, his breathing deep and even. She lay there, listening to the storm and the steady rhythm of his breath, and she felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost a physical ache. This small, rough cabin, this man beside her, this was her world, and it was a world she had chosen. She thought of the man he was, the quiet, solitary man who had lived his life at a distance. A ghost on the edge of the world. She had seen the ghosts he carried in the back of his gray eyes, the old pains he never spoke of. He had faced down gunmen for her, had taken a bullet for her, had followed her into the mouth of hell. But she knew that for a man like Will, the true battlefield was not in a dusty street, but in the quiet, guarded spaces of his own heart. The real act of courage was not facing another man's gun, but allowing another person to get close enough to see his scars. She moved, turning on her side to face him, in the faint, ruddy glow. She could just make out the hard lines of his face, softened now in sleep. He was a man made of whipcord and iron, but she knew, with an absolute certainty, that there was a place inside him that was as fragile and as fiercely protected as her own had once been. Gently, so as not to wake him, she laid her hand on his chest. She could feel the slow, steady beat of his heart beneath her palm, a strong, dependable rhythm against the chaos of the storm outside. It was the sound of her own safety. His eyes opened. He had not been sleeping. He had been lying there, listening to the storm with her. He didn't speak, just looked at her, his gaze clear and direct in the dim light. She felt a sudden, sharp need to understand, to bridge the final, silent gap between them. Her voice, when she spoke, was a whisper, a sound that was barely more than a breath in the quiet cabin. "Are you afraid?" It was not a question about the storm, or the winter, or the possibility that Thorne's influence might one day find them again. It was a question about this, about them, about the quiet, fragile, beautiful thing they were building together within these four walls. She was asking if he was afraid of her, of the permanence she represented, of the home he had never had. He was silent for a long time, so long that she thought he would not answer. He turned his head and looked toward the small window, where the first, faint, gray light of the storm-shrouded dawn was beginning to appear. The wind howled, rattling the wooden shutter. "Yes," he said, his voice low and rough, the word a confession in the darkness. Clara felt her own heart ache, an echo of his old, familiar pain. She had pushed too far. She had trespassed into a place he kept locked away. But then he spoke again, his gaze still fixed on the gray light outside. "But for the first time," he continued, his voice softer now, filled with a raw, quiet wonder, "I'm afraid of losing something beautiful." The words settled in the small, warm space between them. A truth more powerful than any vow, more binding than any law. He was not afraid of being tied down. He was afraid of being set adrift again. He was not afraid of her. He was afraid of a world without her. It was the most honest, vulnerable, and complete declaration of love he was capable of making. Clara did not say anything. There were no words that could answer a confession like that. Instead, she moved her hand from his chest and found his. Her fingers laced through his, a firm, warm grip. It was not a gesture of comfort, but of agreement, a silent promise, a treaty signed in the heart of a storm. She held his hand, and she didn't let go. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let us know where in the world you are. Let's connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and support us further by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.